Have you ever looked at the timeline of human history and wondered, is it all just a random series of events? Or is there some grand underlying design? Like, what if the rise and fall of empires, the birth of groundbreaking philosophies, and all those massive revolutions weren't just political or economic shifts? What if they were actually a meticulously crafted spiritual plan, completely driven by reincarnating souls? It's a massive, paradigm-shifting question for sure, and it is exactly what we are going to look at today.
Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're examining a highly unique revisionist perspective on Western history as it's laid out in the book The Golden Laws by Ryuho Okawa. We are going to impartially map out the text's absolute central claim, the idea that human history is essentially an overarching divine narrative completely designed to educate the human soul. It's a really fascinating alternative framework that blends historical events with some incredibly deep metaphysical concepts. Okay, let's dive into this. We'll be looking at 1. The curse of materialism. 2. Greece and Rome. 3. Visions of utopia. 4. The storm of the Reformation. And 5. Idealism to atheism. Section 1. The curse of materialism. So, our first era focuses on an overarching philosophical battle, looking specifically at Chapter 2 of the Golden Laws, which is titled Running Across the Land. We're neutrally analyzing the author's claim that humanity's historical journey is ultimately meant to break what he calls the curse of materialism. It's basically the idea that history is a curriculum, one that's designed to free humans from believing the physical world is the absolute only thing that exists. To explain this, the author actually redefines a pretty popular philosophical concept. You might be familiar with Karl Popper's idea of the open society. Well, this text takes that term and gives it a total spiritual spin. An open society, according to this framework, is one that successfully bridges both the physical and the spiritual realms. It's a society that's fully aware of a greater existence. In stark contrast to that, a closed society is one that's trapped. It's trapped either by primitive taboos or by strict materialistic limits, completely blind to absolutely anything beyond the 5 physical senses. Section 2. Greece and Rome. To see how heaven supposedly tried to build this open society, we move chronologically to ancient Greece. Now, what's really interesting here is the bold metaphysical claim about the giants of Greek philosophy. The author posits that figures like Socrates and Plato weren't just, brilliant thinkers, they were spiritually awake beings. The text literally claims that Socrates would enter deep meditative trances where his soul would actually leave his physical body to converse with high spirits in the heavenly realms, and then he'd bring that divine wisdom right back down to shape Western civilization. And this brilliantly illustrates the book's core concept of spiritual lineage and reincarnation. The text claims that the great logical mind of Aristotle didn't just exist once. No. According to this timeline, Aristotle's soul reincarnated in China as the Zen master Mumon Ikon to revitalize Eastern philosophy, and then it returned again in Japan as the famous modern philosopher Kitaro Nishida. It's framed as this deeply interconnected cross-cultural spiritual curriculum where the exact same soul returns to teach completely different lessons. But, as you might guess, the curriculum wasn't always successful. As we shift from the absolute heights of Greek philosophy to the stoicism of Roman thinkers like Cicero, the focus really moved toward building an eternal physical empire. However, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, the text suggests a pretty harsh lesson was learned. The collapse of eternal Rome essentially proved that humanity could never achieve true immortality in the physical realm, whether as individual people or as these massive empires. True eternity, the text argues, belongs only to the spiritual realm. Section 3. Visions of Utopia. Recognizing the failure of those physical empires, human thought transitioned to a totally new concept. You've definitely heard the word utopia used to describe a perfect, imaginary society. But this text provides a highly specific, very spiritual definition. Here, utopia is defined not just as an ideal political state, but as the literal earthly manifestation of the high spiritual realms, specifically the Bodhisattva and Tathagata realms. It's essentially the blueprint for pulling heaven directly down to earth. The text points to several key historical blueprints for this heaven on earth. We have Thomas More's Utopia with its planned economy, Augustine's City of God, and Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, which sought to use science and natural laws to conquer human hardship. What is especially fascinating right here is the author's claim regarding Francis Bacon. The text asserts that Bacon was actually a reincarnated high spirit with memories of ancient Atlantis, and, get this, that his soul would later return to Earth as the highly renowned German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Section 4.
this storm of the Reformation. But blueprints for utopia just weren't enough. By the 16th century, the existing religious structures had become incredibly stagnant. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. This single, massive act of defiance against the Roman Catholic Church's sale of indulgences ignited an absolute religious firestorm all across Europe. So, the crucial point is how this text interprets Luther's fiery passion. According to the author, Martin Luther was not just some disgruntled monk. The text claims he was the literal reincarnation of Archangel Michael. Armed with his conscience and the Bible, this archangel was sent down to violently tear down the corruption of Rome and wake up the dormant faith of the people. He was acting as a divine wrecking ball against a closed society.
However, the heavenly plan had to adapt. The text notes that the religious fervor of the Reformation eventually led to strict theocracies under figures like Calvin and Cromwell. Because these religious governments were often intolerant and frankly didn't last, heaven purportedly shifted tactics. Instead of trying to rule through direct religious authority, high spirits changed their approach to establish modern, secular political principles. To do this, the text claims heaven sent down the philosopher John Locke to completely separate religion from statecraft and establish the empirical foundations of modern democracy.
Section 5. Idealism to Atheism.
This political shift leads us perfectly right into our final historical epic. The text asserts that to firmly establish idealistic philosophy in Europe, the ancient giants of thought were deployed once again. Now, we mentioned earlier that Francis Bacon purportedly returned as Immanuel Kant. Building on that, the text claims that the great ancient Greek philosopher Plato was reborn as Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. These towering figures of German idealism were allegedly sent to re-anchor human thought firmly in the reality of the spiritual realm. But, for every action, there is a reaction. The text heavily contrasts these idealists with a steep descent into atheism. Just as Plato had an ancient philosophical rival in the materialist thinker Epicurus, the text claims that this intellectual rivalry was reborn in the modern era. Epicurus, the author asserts, reincarnated as Karl Marx to push humanity in the exact opposite direction, toward pure atheistic materialism. To understand the true gravity of this counter-movement from the text's perspective, we can look at how it describes the Epicurean and Marxist materialist view. The quote reads, "Humans are merely decomposing atoms, overcoming the disaster of death through dissolution." We are presenting these politically and philosophically charged claims with complete neutrality here, just to show you exactly how the author frames the ultimate closed society, a worldview where the soul is denied entirely and humanity is basically reduced to nothing more than biological machinery. And that brings us to the end of our chronological journey through this truly unique framework. We've gone from the ancient dialogues of Socrates all the way to the philosophical battlegrounds of Marx and Hegel, viewing it all through the lens of reincarnating souls and divine intervention. It leaves us with a really profound and provocative question to ponder. If human history really is a continuously adapting spiritual curriculum, what is our next lesson? Will we succumb to the confusion of modern times, what the book interestingly refers to as the dwarf stance? Or will we break through the thoughts of the end of the century to find a totally new spiritual dawn? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating explainer with me today. Keep asking those big questions.